This is Pacifica Radio's Letters on Politics. On today's show,
the Trump administration has trotted out a number of excuses or pretexts for this assassination, and some of them do involve self-defense. It's being alleged by Pompeo and Trump that Soleimani was coming back to Iraq to kill Americans. This is not what Prime Minister Abdul Mahdi told the Iraqi parliament. He said that Saudi Arabia had reached out to him to seek to cool down the tensions with Iran and as a mediator, and that Abdul Mahdi had passed a message over to Tehran and then had invited Soleimani to Baghdad for consultations with regard to this Saudi diplomacy.
Was the U.S. assassination of Iranian General Qasem Soleimani meant to disrupt talks between Iran and Saudi Arabia? That's a possibility that we'll explore with Juan Cole, who's founder and chief editor of Informed Comment and professor of Middle East history at the University of Michigan. He is the author of the book, Muhammad, Prophet of Peace Amid the Clash of Empires. On today's show, we'll also talk about the very latest concerning the Senate impeachment trial of Donald Trump. That's next on Letters on Politics. But first, the news.
I'm Max Pringle with these headlines. Hundreds of thousands of Iranians came out today in the streets of Tehran for the funeral of Iranian military commander Qasem Soleimani. U.S. forces killed him last week in an airstrike in Iraq. Meanwhile, the Iraqi parliament has voted to expel American forces from the country in reaction to the strike, which also killed Iraqi militia members. President Trump has threatened Iraq with sanctions in response. More from Feature Story News' Kate Fisher.
Donald Trump doubled down on his threat to target areas of cultural importance to the Iranians. He spoke to reporters on board Air Force One, his aeroplane, as he returned back to Washington from his Christmas break in Florida. And he used really very aggressive language, saying, if they're allowed to kill our people, they're allowed to torture and maim our people, they're allowed to use roadside bombs and blow up our people, and we're not allowed to touch their cultural site, it doesn't work that way. He was also very strong regarding the suggestion that the Iraqis had taken that voted to expel foreign forces from Iraq. And he said that if the Iraqis went ahead with that he would sanction Iraq. He would put tougher sanctions on Iraq than those that he had already put on Iran, suggesting that they would make the Iranian sanctions look somewhat tame.
And that's Kate Fisher reporting. For more on what's likely to come next in the tit-for-tat U.S. conflict with Iran, I spoke with Dr. Gunsheh Tazmini. She's a visiting scholar and Iran expert at the London School of Economics. I asked her what she thought of the Trump administration's claim that the killing of Qasem Soleimani was to make Americans safer. She said that's unlikely now that passions in the region have been inflamed.
We have non-state actors, we have militias, we have individuals, we have Shia fanatics, we have all sorts of things that can come out of this, that can create damage to not only U.S. assets, but also individuals.
Tasmini said the strike also had the effect of diminishing the prospects for reformers and pro-democratic moderates to make any gains under the current political atmosphere.
Now the priority is national security. It's not about reform or civil society or pluralism. Those are no longer considered important, especially because those processes are seen to invite foreign interference and destabilization and possibly regime change. And all of these have now been declared. They've all been put on the table under Trump's administration.
That's Gunsheh Tazmini. She's a visiting Iran scholar at the London School of Economics. Former National Security Advisor John Bolton said today that he's prepared to testify if he's subpoenaed by the Senate in its impeachment trial. Bolton, who left the White House in September, said that he has weighed the issues of executive privilege and that after careful consideration and study, decided that he would comply with the Senate subpoena. In a statement, Bolton said, quote, "I have concluded that if the Senate issues a subpoena for my testimony, I'm prepared to testify," unquote. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell has publicly expressed resistance to calling new witnesses in the trial, though Democrats are pressing to hear from Bolton and others who declined to appear before the House's inquiry in the upcoming proceedings. Disgraced Hollywood mogul Harvey Weinstein has arrived at a New York court where his lawyers and a judge are handling the final preparations for his trial on charges of rape and sexual assault. Jury selection is scheduled to start this week. Weinstein faces allegations that he raped one woman in a Manhattan hotel room in 2013 and performed a forcible sex act on a different woman in 2006. Weinstein pleaded not guilty and says any sexual activity was consensual. If he's convicted of the most serious charges against him, he faces a mandatory life sentence. Some 80 women in all have accused Weinstein of sexual misconduct. California's legislative leaders are considering borrowing money to prepare the state for the next climate-fueled catastrophe. Lawmakers in the Democratic-controlled legislature return to work this week. Their to-do list includes a $4.2 billion proposal to borrow money before they need it to prepare for wildfires and other natural disasters. Some Republicans are skeptical. They say California should use existing money to address the problem. I'm Max Pringle. You're listening to Letters and Politics on KPFA.
Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. Congress is back after its 2-week winter, really Christmas and New Year's vacation. And on the agenda, and probably what will dominate the debates over these next few weeks, are two things. First, the assassination conducted by the military against top Iranian General Qasem Soleimani. And then the second thing will be that of impeachment. So these are sort of the two things that should be dominating, at least for this month. There may be another issue, and that being the new trade agreement between the United States, Mexico, and Canada that would replace NAFTA. The Senate has indicated a willingness to try to approve that treaty, that new trade treaty, by the end of the month. The House of Representatives has already approved it at the end of last year. But we'll see if the Senate gets to it this month, because, again, I think it is going to be dominated by both the assassination of Qasem Soleimani as well as how impeachment trial will occur in the U.S. Senate after the House of Representatives impeached Donald Trump at the end of the previous year. In a moment, we are going to be in conversation with Middle East expert Juan Cole about how the assassination of Soleimani and others will affect the geopolitical dynamic and the U.S. dynamic in the region. The Iraqi parliament over the weekend approved a resolution calling on the United States to withdraw its troops from Iraq, which potentially could lead to an actual withdrawal after we're talking about almost 17 years now of being in the country. So we're going to talk about all of that with Juan Cole in just a moment. But first, I want to give you an update and talk about what is happening concerning the impeachment of Donald Trump. And the truth is, really nothing has happened since the House approved 2 articles of impeachment against the president. The first article being abuse of power, and the second article being obstruction of Congress. The second one pertaining to the White House refusing to cooperate in any manner whatsoever with the House of Representatives investigation into the alleged pressure campaign that Donald Trump and his aides put on Ukraine in order to get an investigation into Joe Biden. So what has happened? Well, Nancy Pelosi has refused to take the actual pieces of paper that the articles of impeachment are on, the actual physical articles themselves, has refused to take them over, basically walk them over to the other side of the Capitol and to deliver them to the Senate. And believe me, it's not a very hard thing to do. I used to cover Capitol Hill for many years, and it's about a 2-minute walk from one side of the Capitol to the other. You don't have to take any stairs, or you don't have to take an elevator. It's all on the same floor. It's actually quite a lovely walk. I always enjoyed it greatly. You start at the chamber of the House of Representatives, where Nancy Pelosi also has her office. You walk through what's called Statuary Hall. They call it Statuary Hall, which is this other sort of hall room called Statuary Hall because every state has a statue in there. And oddly speaking, the state of Mississippi still has a statue of Jefferson Davis, who was the president of the Confederacy during the Civil War. So anyways, let's not get too far off topic here. So you walk through, it's a very beautiful room. It's where the old House of Representatives used to meet before they expanded the Capitol building itself. So you walk through there, and then you go through the dome. You see the big dome from the outside. Well, on the inside, it's quite beautiful in there too. You walk through there. It's sort of majestic and royal, I guess, regal, I guess. And then you walk through another room that has its smaller dome, and then you get to the Senate chamber, where you have the office of Mitch McConnell, and you deliver it to him so that the Senate can proceed with working on a trial, an impeachment trial against President Donald Trump. Well, Nancy Pelosi has not walked those papers over, nor has she had any of her people walk those papers over. And can she do this? Obviously, she can. And the reason being, and we've talked about this a lot over the past couple of months, is right in the Constitution itself. The Constitution says that the House of Representatives has the sole power to conduct impeachment. And what that means is that the Senate has no say in how the House operates, how the House does impeachment, and the courts won't be able to step in either. This is all the prerogative of Nancy Pelosi as Speaker of the House. Now, there is an argument, and this is being brought by Republican Senator Lindsey Graham of South Carolina, that the Senate can change their rules and how they begin their own impeachment trial, and which they wouldn't actually need the documents, the actual physical articles themselves to start a trial, an impeachment trial, but that they could just go off of, the language is available for everyone to see. It's not classified or secret documents. You could just go, print them out yourself and begin with that process. The only thing is, though, to change the Senate rules concerning impeachment, it would take a 2/3 vote. So you would need 67 of the 100 senators to approve such a rule change, which would mean you would need about 14 Democrats to cross the aisle and join you. That's very unlikely to happen. So why is Nancy Pelosi holding on to these articles of impeachment? Well, it's simple. She doesn't like how the Republican Senate Majority Leader, Mitch McConnell of Kentucky, has talked about proceeding with the trial. Mitch McConnell on Sean Hannity's show on Fox News said that he was taking his cues for the trial from the White House, from the very entity that is being charged, and that there's really no difference between what he wants and what the White House would want with an impeachment trial. And so that is, that's obviously one reason why they're doing it. The other reason is that they want witnesses to participate in a Senate trial, which it doesn't appear Mitch McConnell is interested in, even though the White House is, though the White House wants different witnesses than, say, do the Democrats in the House. But the Democratic Minority Leader, Chuck Schumer, is calling on for witnesses to be called, and it would include John Bolton, who is a former national security advisor to Donald Trump, Mick Mulvaney, who is the acting chief of staff to Donald Trump, two people who are probably the closest to the president. At least those two positions usually are the closest, the chief of staff and the national security advisor, two of the positions closest to the president that works on a daily basis, if not hourly basis, with the president. So they want them to testify, and they also want Michael Duffy to testify. Now, Michael Duffy is an important player in this whole game because Michael Duffy is a top official in the Office of Management and Budget. It's the OMB, and the OMB controls how the money is spent and where the money goes. And, of course, this pertains to the withholding of the $391 million in military aid to Ukraine. And Michael Duffy would have intimate knowledge about how that order occurred. In fact, there's new evidence that may bolster the Democrats' call to have Michael Duffy testify in an impeachment trial, and that is the Center for Public Integrity received about 300 documents from the administration, from the Office of Management and Budget, that showed several things. The first one, that the Pentagon was actually scared that it was breaking the law by not doling out the $391 million to Ukraine. There is a law called the Impeachment Control Act, which was signed reluctantly by Richard Nixon in 1974. And I say reluctantly, this was just before he was actually impeached. And the reason Congress pushed the Impeachment Control Act on him was because Richard Nixon wasn't fully funding the programs, and I think a lot of these were like environmental-based programs, funding the programs that Congress had appropriated. So, if a president doesn't like the initiatives that's coming from Congress, I'm just not going to send that money to the initiatives that they're calling for. Well, that's a lot of power that the president then would have. So Congress basically forced, and maybe he did it because he saw impeachment coming or potentially being impeached, forced this bill, the Impeachment Control Act, onto Richard Nixon. He did sign it, so it became law. And so now, with Ukraine, if the Pentagon and the Office of Management and Budget did not dole out that $391 million to Ukraine by the end of the fiscal year, which would then cancel those payments and cancel that money, the Congress would have to go reapprove funding for Ukraine, that would be a violation of the law and that they could be breaking the law. In fact, we even heard, it was in a closed session in the House Intelligence Committee, Mark Sandy, the only official from the Office of Management and Budget, testify that there were at least a couple of OMB employees who resigned because of this. So there was concern both in the OMB and the Pentagon about potentially breaking the law by not doling out that money. Now you can say, well, why not just spend that entire $391 million on the last day? That's your prerogative, which it could be. I mean, as long as you had the money out there in time before the deadline, which would have canceled the money altogether, you're actually still not necessarily breaking the law. But what they were concerned about is that it's not that easy just to write a check for $391 million. That's not how it works. It goes out in installments, and there's probably requirements that have to occur and things and I don't know if this is actually true for Ukraine, but this is how it normally works, right? You need reporting requirements from the entity that's receiving the money, receipts, it's just not, here's the money and that's it. So they were very concerned that the money was not going to be doled out again to Ukraine, and that would end up being a violation of the law that they would be guilty of for doing that. So that's the first thing that we found from these documents that the Center for Public Integrity got through a FOIA request. Interestingly, the Democrats did not get these documents in their impeachment investigation, but this journalistic outfit did. Then there's an additional story that's related to these documents, and this involves another organization called Just Security, which works on security issues. And they say, it's been widely reported on, that they were able to see, they were shown the same documents that the Center for Public Integrity received, but they were able to see the unredacted versions. And that in those unredacted versions, one of the things that were redacted that was sent to the Center for Public Integrity was that Michael Duffy, again of the OMB, had indicated in the email that the order to withhold that $391 million, that was directly ordered by what he wrote, POTUS, which stands for President of the United States. That potentially could be the hardest link that we have so far, that the withholding of the military aid came from Donald Trump himself. Now, many people suspect it had, but we've been looking for that smoking gun. Now, you want to follow up on it. You want Michael Duffy to testify and all these things. But it's pretty strong evidence that is being shown there. And so Chuck Schumer is calling for Michael Duffy to testify in a Senate impeachment trial. Now, Mitch McConnell wants no witnesses. I think basically Mitch McConnell wants everyone, the floor managers for the House of Representatives to make their case, for Trump's lawyers to make their case, and then the senators to be able to ask questions to both sides through written format. Senators aren't actually, as jurors, aren't actually allowed to participate in this. And then have the vote, and that be it. Now, what's the likelihood that Chuck Schumer can get what he is calling for? Well, it's not actually impossible, because it's not in the end up to Mitch McConnell how the impeachment trial will proceed. It's actually what the rules that they will go by is what they can get 51 votes for. And right now, Democrats have 47 votes in the Senate. They have 47 members of the 100 members. So they need 4 Republicans to cross the aisle and join them in voting for rules that would call on the witnesses that Chuck Schumer is asking for. That's not entirely impossible. There are already 2 Republican senators, Lisa Murkowski of Alaska and Susan Collins of Maine, who have already publicly come out and criticized Mitch McConnell for saying that he's taken his cues from the White House. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that they would side with the Democrats in rules pertaining to an impeachment trial, but it's a sign that the possibility is there. Then you have Republicans like Mitt Romney of Utah, who hasn't really weighed in on this issue, but has been a consistent critical voice against Donald Trump in the Senate as a Republican. So that's another possible vote. That's 3. Now you need 1 more, right? Maybe you get someone like Lamar Alexander of Tennessee. He's retiring at the end of this year. And so he doesn't have a lot to lose if he were to cross over. I'm not saying he's going to. I'm not saying there are the 4 votes, but it's conceivable that there would be the 4 votes to call for witnesses that Chuck Schumer is asking for. And then the other question is, well, then if those witnesses testify, what about the witnesses that Donald Trump wants, right? They want Hunter Biden to testify. They want the whistleblower to be subpoenaed and forced to testify in the trial. So would that happen too? We'll still have to wait and see. We are, again, as I was saying, at the point where we were before when the House impeached the president. So what if, I don't think this is going to happen, but what is the possibility that Nancy Pelosi never sends the articles of impeachment over to the Senate, just leaves it where it is? Doubtful that's going to happen. There's a lot of talk on Capitol Hill this week that it may even happen this week, that they actually may send the articles of impeachment to the Senate this week. We'll see. They haven't confirmed that that's what they're going to do, but there is belief by many lawmakers that eventually the articles will be sent to the House. That said, and I don't know if this was the plan, but I think it's a bit of an ingenious move by Nancy Pelosi not to send the articles of impeachment to the Senate, and perhaps not to ever send the articles of impeachment to the Senate. And here's why. First, Donald Trump has been impeached. He will always be the 3rd president in United States history to have been impeached by the House of Representatives. There is no changing that. Second, if there is never a Senate trial, he will never be acquitted. Sure, he'll never be removed from office either, but I don't think anyone thought he ever was going to be removed from office. But he will never have that ability to say he won, that he was acquitted by the Senate. It'll just be looming there forever, basically, as being the 3rd president in U.S. history to be impeached. The third reason is that even through this impeachment process in the House of Representatives, with the hearings that were broadcasted on television and radio and over the internet that dominated the media landscape for weeks, that was basically free media. We did it too, by the Democrats making a case that you have this criminal element at the top level of government. In the Oval Office, the president himself, that you're not going to be able to undo. So there is the other. And then finally, Nancy Pelosi will always be able to point to the words of Mitch McConnell by saying he's going to take his cues from the White House in conducting this trial. She will always be able to point to Mitch McConnell as the reason for not sending the articles of impeachment to the Senate, because that it wasn't going to be a fair trial. So I actually think that move's a pretty ingenious move. Now, do I think that that's what they're going to end up doing? Probably not. But that's just in my own mind of what is possible. So that's where we are with the issue of impeachment. We will see what happens. Very likely that we still have a trial. I thought we were going to actually begin the trial this week before, but we'll probably more likely begin the trial by the end of the month. But we will see. Again, we know about as much now concerning an impeachment trial as we did right after the House approved the 2 articles of impeachment. Now, the other big issue that's going to be dominating politics on Capitol Hill is the U.S. assassination of Iranian military leader Qasem Soleimani and others. There is not bipartisan support, far from it, on Capitol Hill concerning the assassination. Democratic lawmakers are saying that they will bring measures to try to restrict President Trump's ability to order military strikes against Iran. Nancy Pelosi has said that she will bring a resolution that invokes the War Powers Act of 1973 to try to force the president to have to get congressional approval in order to strike Iran here on out, moving into the future. In the Senate, Minority Leader Chuck Schumer of New York said this, quote, "I will do everything I can to assert our authority. We do not need this president either bumbling or impulsively getting us into a major war." Now, previously, and perhaps tangentially, both the Senate and the House approved a measure to stop U.S. support, you'll remember, for Saudi Arabia's war in Yemen. And that, again, that resolution was approved, including in the Republican-controlled Senate. However, that was vetoed by the president because it is subject to vetoes. And then once you get a veto, if you want to override that veto, you need a 2/3 vote majority in order to be able to do that, which they were unable to get that in the Senate. In the Senate, there were 7 Republicans who supported the resolution concerning restricting U.S. involvement and support of Saudi Arabia's war in Yemen. So there are more pushes. Democratic Senator Tim Kaine of Virginia says that he is going to try to force a debate on the Senate floor this week over military actions against Iran. Independent Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont and Democratic Representative Ro Khanna of California, they are both introducing measures to restrict funds from being used in attacking Iran. And Representatives Democrats Barbara Lee of California, Ilhan Omar of Minnesota have also co-sponsored a measure to remove U.S. troops from hostilities against Iran, and hostilities against Iran that has not been approved by Congress. All these measures, again, are susceptible to a presidential veto. But here is what I actually think is important about this, and it ties in the entire issue of impeachment, and that is this continual drift of what we call the imperial presidency, right? The imperial presidency. And this is not something that has begun with Donald Trump. This is something that has been developing over, the last 7 decades or so. We were talking about the 1973 War Powers Act. The 1973 War Powers Act, that was forced onto Richard Nixon as well, just as I was talking about earlier, the Impoundment Control Act was also forced on President Nixon because Congress was seeing a president that thought the president was acting like he was out of control, a king upon himself. And the War Powers Act came in response both to the Vietnam War and the Korean War, since those were the first 2 wars that we have that we didn't get congressional approval for war or a congressional declaration of war. So they brought in the War Powers Act to try to restrict the president. Kind of had the opposite effect because it was watered down so much to allow a president basically to take any military action whatsoever as long as and have like as many as 90 days to do it before Congress can actually rein the president in. So it hasn't turned out the way I think people are actually hoping it would. But that said, what we have is a situation of growing presidential power, both in the realms of military conflict and then also this abuse of power of asking a foreign government to investigate your political rival. And I think we're seeing, and this isn't the first time, but I think it's going to intensify this month, but certainly under Donald Trump, a push by Congress to try to grab back, to try to retain some of that some of the power that it has relinquished over the decades. And again, this doesn't begin with Donald Trump. In fact, I firmly believe that if Donald Trump was, quote unquote, more of what we would consider to be a conventional president, I'm not sure he would be impeached for either the situation concerning Ukraine or the assassination of Qasem Soleimani. I suspect he probably wouldn't be if he was more conventional. But we have a position, the presidency, and again, this term, the imperial presidency, in which we see that this position has become all-powerful and is prime for abuse. And now you have a situation in which, some would call a madman in this position, just like you did with Richard Nixon. And then you start to see these efforts to try to rein the position of presidency in so that these things don't happen again, even though they have happened again. So important times, my friends. I would follow what's happening on Capitol Hill because there are precedents one way or the other that are being set that we'll have to listen and that we'll have to that will be affected by for the years to come. Okay, now I want to get into the situation of the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, top Iranian general that the United States conducted at the end of last week. And I want to talk about what this means for the region, what this means for the United States and the region. And for that conversation, I'm joined by Skype by Juan Cole, who is the founder and chief editor of Informed Comment that you can find online. He is the Richard P. Mitchell Professor of History at the University of Michigan. He is the author of a number of books. His latest is called Muhammad, Prophet of Peace Amid the Clash of Empires. Juan Cole, it's my very good pleasure to welcome you to this program.
Thanks so much for having me, Mitch.
I want to begin by getting your sense of the importance and what it means of how the Iraqi parliament responded to the assassination over the weekend. It has been reported that it was a non-binding resolution, but nonetheless, the Iraqi parliament approved a resolution calling on U.S. troops to fully withdraw from Iraq, my understanding. How significant is that?
Oh, it's tremendous. It's something that the hardline Shiite factions in Iraq have wanted for some time, since the threat of ISIL or ISIS has declined. And they tried last March to pass something through the parliament, and they couldn't get it through. So the fact that they were able to pass it this time is a real sea change in Iraqi politics. The resolution is not non-binding. It's a binding resolution. In fact, it was introduced to Parliament by the sitting caretaker Prime Minister, Adel Abdel Mahdi, which is, I think what people mean when they say it's non-binding is that Iraq's parliament is weak. And so a lot of legislation has to go through the executive. They use executive orders. So what it really is a demand by Parliament that the executive carry this out, but they can't make the executive do it. Since the executive introduced the motion, however, it seems to me a very serious development.
So that's an important point, because when we hear non-binding, and that's how it was reported in my reading of what happened with the Iraqi parliament over the weekend, it was described as non-binding. And when we think of non-binding here with our own Congress, it's usually just a resolution of intent rather than something that would have the teeth of law. But that's a very different situation in Iraq. It just sounds like the Iraqi parliament doesn't have the authority to force a U.S. troop withdrawal.
Right. The parliament by itself can't do it. Although legislation is being prepared, because the parliament did pass legislation to authorize the U.S. presence. And so it can undo that authorization. But ultimately, the practical steps have to be taken by the executive.
Now, the Iraqi Prime Minister Mahdi, as you indicated, he's now serving as a caretaker role because he had resigned in November, but he's still occupying the position. He supported the resolution. Can he force this to happen?
Well, he introduced the resolution. That's a matter of debate in Iraqi politics, whether Abdul Mahdi has the mandate to carry this measure through by himself. But the likelihood is that he will be succeeded by someone from his party or an allied party who has very much the same view on these matters as he does. The prime minister is not directly elected in Iraq, but the parties are. At least that's been the case up until now. And so the parties will supply the prime minister. And it's very much similar to what happened in Britain when Theresa May succeeded David Cameron. So May's policies weren't terribly different from Cameron's, and I think that will be the case with Abdul Mahdi's successor.
We have a parliamentarian system in Iraq. When is the next election, and do you think this will be the major issue in that election, the presence of U.S. troops?
Well, they have elections every 4 years, and they had one in 2018, so they're not due for an election.
Okay. So does that mean Mahdi stays in this position for until the next election, or?
No, he has resigned pending a successor being chosen, and so the ruling parties in Iraq, which are all Shiite religious parties, will put forward a nominee to the president, who will then take the nominee to the parliament. And the parliament will then approve the new prime minister. So a nominee was put forward from Abdul Mahdi's party, who was the governor of Basra. And a lot of Iraqi politics right now had been dictated by these massive youth demonstrations in downtown Baghdad and in other cities like Nasiriyah in the south. And they were unhappy with the Basra governor because he was in power at a time when troops fired on the protesters. Over 500 protesters were killed in Iraq in October and November. And those downtown Baghdad protests and their counterparts in other Iraqi cities are ongoing and are having an enormous impact on parliamentary politics. So I think the initial attempt to replace Abdul Mahdi with a clone ran into trouble from the Iraqi street. But nevertheless, it's impossible that he's not succeeded by somebody from his or an allied party.
If and when Iraq gets its new prime minister, and it's still the will of Parliament and that prime minister to call on U.S. troops to withdraw, that would seem like an extremely critical moment. We heard Mike Pompeo over the week, and I think he described the resolution as non-binding in his TV appearances on the Sunday morning talk shows, political shows. How would you expect the United States to respond if Parliament and the Prime Minister both call on the United States to leave the country?
Well, Mr. Trump tweeted last night or gave an impromptu press conference in which he said that he wouldn't leave unless Iraq paid him back the money that the U.S. had spent to build Al-Balad Air Force Base in Iraq, and that if he did leave, that he would then turn around and place the most severe sanctions on Iraq you've ever seen, is what he said. So apparently the Trump administration would react in a grudging and petulant way to this development. This is unprecedented, this response from Mr. Trump in modern U.S. history. U.S. bases are bilateral agreements between parties, and when one party asks the U.S. to leave, it always does, or it always has in the past. That's one of the things that I think the American public is confused about, because in the Philippines, for instance, after the People's Power Revolution in the 1980s, in the early 90s, the Filipino Senate asked the U.S. Navy to leave Subic Naval Base in the Philippines. And I can't tell you how much Annapolis really, really wanted that base, but they left when they were asked to. So this is quite unusual for Trump to deploy this sort of threat.
Do you think this is a situation we could very well be looking at here in the coming months?
Oh, absolutely. My expectation is that Parliament will stick to its resolution and that the next Prime Minister will enable the legislation necessary to implement it. Mr. Trump's threats notwithstanding, the U.S. cannot operate in a country where there's the rule of law. The authorities have asked the U.S. troops to leave, because then the troops themselves become liable to legal action if there's no authorization for them to operate in Iraq. If, for instance, they went out on a mission to deal with remnants of ISIL in the Iraqi countryside and civilians were killed, they could be hauled before an Iraqi judge and charged with murder or manslaughter. If there's no extraterritoriality, if there's no agreement from Parliament that their mission in Iraq is authorized, then they just could go to jail for the rest of their lives or be executed by the Iraqi civil authorities.
Does the United States have any sway, influence on Parliament in Iraq?
Well, ordinarily it does. And the reports are that the State Department worked all of its contacts to try to prevent this vote from going forward on Sunday and failed. The reporting is that the State Department found that people were just too angry and that the vote really had to be held. Iraq is divided on this issue because it is the majority Shiite parties that are so het up about the assassination of Qasem Soleimani and of Abu Mahdi al-Mohandes on Friday morning. So the Sunnis are a little worried that if the U.S. troops left, ISIL could come back, and of course it mainly preyed on Sunni areas, and B, that without the U.S. counterbalance, Iran would just become enormously powerful. And it's the Shiite power the Sunnis are afraid of. Likewise, the Kurds in the northeast of Iraq have all along, since the 90s, been very pro-American and seen an American political influence in Baghdad as a moderating influence. And so they also are not happy about this prospect of U.S. troops leaving. And so the Kurds and the Sunnis more or less boycotted the parliamentary vote in hopes of keeping there from being a quorum for the vote. But they failed. The Shiites were so united and so angry, and they are the majority, they were able to have the vote. They had a quorum, and they had 51%.
That's interesting, and I guess not so unfamiliar in long-term conflicts. But of course, when the United States first invaded Iraq in 2003, it was to topple a Sunni leader, Saddam Hussein. Now you're finding Sunnis sort of wanting a U.S. presence, at least some, because they're afraid what would happen to them if the U.S. left.
Yes, the Sunnis in Iraq, have resentments about the overthrow of the Saddam Hussein government in some ways, but of course it was a horrible, oppressive government, and they suffered from it as well. And the resentments are mainly that in the wake of that overthrow, religious Shiite parties came to power in Iraq. They came to power first in the 2005 elections sponsored by George W. Bush. And that's not what anybody in Iraq was hoping for. In the wake of Saddam Hussein, it was hoped that some sort of liberal democracy could flourish. The parties that came to power are some of them are more pragmatic than others, but they have a theocratic ideology.
This is Letters on Politics, and we are in conversation with Juan Cole, who is founder and chief editor of Informed Comment that can be found online. He is the Richard P. Mitchell Professor of History at the University of Michigan, author of a number of books. His latest is called Muhammad, Prophet of Peace Amid the Clash of Empires. Juan Cole, some may accuse me of burying the lead here in our conversation because I did not begin necessarily with the assassination of Qasem Soleimani itself. I felt it was really important to put some attention on Iraq's parliament actually calling on U.S. troops to withdraw. So I wanted to lead there, but I don't want to ignore the assassination. What do you think the assassinations, the two, I guess now, political assassinations mean for the region?
Yeah, there were a number of people killed. The two that are prominent were military commanders, one in Iraq and one in Iran. Well, again, this is unprecedented in recent U.S. history. Qasem Soleimani was not a terrorist. He was not a leader of a non-governmental small network. He was a state official. He was kind of the equivalent of the general that heads the United States Bureau of the National Guard. And so killing a state official in that way is not normal. And in fact, the political scientists I'm talking to can't think of another example of it in modern history. So obviously, the U.S. has had people assassinated in the past, but they most often have done so covertly, and they haven't been generals on the whole. So during the entire Cold War, the United States was at times in pretty hot conflict with the Soviet Union, but no Soviet general was ever targeted in this way. And it would have been unwise to do so because the Soviet Union was a nuclear power. So this is, we're entering uncharted territory here. And it's a bad influence on the world. Now India is saying, well, why shouldn't we take out some Pakistani generals? So
they are saying that in response to what happened?
Yes.
Is that normal? I mean, if the United States did it, I mean, we hear this as a talking point, but does that actually happen? The United States did it. Why can't we?
Yeah, people look to the United States as a global leader. It's the world's sole superpower, and it sets a tone for the rest of the world. In a global South setting of relatively poor and weaker countries, if they do something and people complain about it domestically, they say, well, the United States did it. The United States is a superpower. It becomes a precedent politically.
And again, the importance of this. Now, the United States has been involved in political assassination for years. Previous presidents have ordered assassinations. Obama did, George W. Bush did, and so on and so on. But what they hadn't done was assassinate a general from a state that is widely recognized by the rest of the world. Is that accurate?
Well, there's a nuance here, which is that under the Ford administration back in the 70s, a law was passed and Ford signed it outlawing assassination. So technically speaking, the United States government may not assassinate people. It's illegal. And what has been being done where drones have been deployed against members of Al-Qaeda or ISIL is that that's been interpreted as self-defense. And in the United Nations Charter and international law and U.S. law, self-defense is always a valid basis on which to deploy lethal force. So if a terrorist were plotting to blow up, God forbid, something in the United States government holds that it's legitimate to take that person out preemptively as a matter of self-defense. This has never been tested in the courts, and in fact, drone strikes run by the CIA are covert and cannot be admitted by the U.S. government. If you asked Secretary of State Mike Pompeo about a covert operation, he would say he would be able neither to deny nor to confirm it. And so it can't go, it's never gone to the courts to be tested. But this was not a covert operation. I believe it was done by the Department of Defense. It was certainly an assassination, as the word is ordinarily used in English. And so I think it probably is illegal under the Ford law. Moreover, the Trump administration has trotted out a number of excuses or pretexts for this assassination, and some of them do involve self-defense. It's being alleged by Pompeo and Trump that Soleimani was coming back to Iraq to kill Americans. This is not what Prime Minister Abdul Mahdi told the Iraqi parliament. He said that Saudi Arabia had reached out to him to seek to cool down the tensions with Iran and as a mediator, and that Abdul Mahdi had passed a message over to Tehran and then had invited Soleimani to Baghdad for consultations with regard to this Saudi diplomacy. Soleimani came to Baghdad on a commercial airliner. He checked through passport control with a diplomatic passport. There was nothing covert about his visit, and it appears to have been that he was the guest of the Iraqi prime minister when he was rubbed out by Trump and company. And so the story that Abdul Mahdi tells is not consistent with the, I think, propaganda of the Trump administration that he was coming there to kill Americans.
If Mahdi is correct in what he said, the reason that Soleimani was there and the outreach from Saudi Arabia to perhaps facilitate some type of communication to the two countries that have been playing their own imperial games in the region, could you imagine the United States wanting to try to disrupt that?
Yes. You could imagine Iran hawks like Pompeo not wanting a rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran, wanting to keep the heat on because their goal is to overthrow the Iranian government. Although Trump says that his goal is not regime change, Pompeo said that he hoped that the assassination of Soleimani would lead to a popular revolution in Iran. Pompeo lives in a fantasy world and knows nothing about Iran. He's a Kansas oil man. And in fact, the assassination of Soleimani has caused Iranians to rally around the regime, even if the regime is unpopular. They may be SOBs, but they're their SOBs. And so you've seen, I think, the biggest crowds in the streets in Iran since the 1979 revolution. some miles-long processions in provincial cities like Ahvaz that they're just something I've not seen in my lifetime since in '79.
On my social media feed, I've seen this debate break out on the left about how to characterize it. And not surprisingly, perhaps for the left, everyone thinks that the assassination was a bad idea and shouldn't have happened. But there are those who will say that you also should acknowledge Soleimani as being somebody who's playing his own imperial war games in the region and has a lot of blood on his hands. Then you have others who will say that that's not the point. You should just, we should be worried about U.S. imperialism and how U.S. operates there. What is your take on what Qasem Soleimani means for the people in the region? And I imagine different people will feel differently about him.
Yeah, well, I wouldn't feel comfortable discussing all that in the context of his assassination. Murderers can be murdered, and the police actually will prosecute the murderer of a murderer. So if we're interested in the rule of law, there wasn't any legal grounds for this action, and it was therefore a crime, regardless of against whom it was committed. I think there's, American exceptionalism is a horrible thing in many ways, because Americans think that they're the bright shining beacon on the hill and can do no wrong, and then they have a tendency to demonize everybody else. I think Qasem Soleimani is guilty of the same sorts of crimes against humanity that George W. Bush is, and yet Americans find it jarring for someone to say that. But Bush illegally invaded Iraq, is at least proximately responsible for the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people, and destabilized the region. And the pretexts on which he went to war have all collapsed, and so it was illegal. Soleimani has likewise headed military campaigns that have killed a lot of people in Syria, for instance, and has been a force for repression of the protesters in Iraq and Iran. I don't think that he's probably directly responsible for nearly as many deaths of people as Bush, but he certainly is a man of the far right, of a theocratic, repressive religious regime, and was no friend of democracy. But he was invited into Syria by the Damascus government. He was invited into Iraq by the Iraqi government, and indeed, in the early years of the fight against ISIL in 2014, 2015, Iran took the lead, helped to organize Shiite militias at a time when the Iraqi army had collapsed. And some of the campaigns, such as the one at Tikrit, north of Baghdad, Saddam's birthplace, was organized and led by Soleimani. When they got bogged down, the United States gave them air support. So at some point, Soleimani has been an active military de facto ally of the United States against terrorism. So the black and white kind of headlines screaming off of the Pompeo press conferences, don't do justice to the complexity of the facts.
Juan Cole is the founder and chief editor of Informed Comment that can be found online. He is the Richard P. Mitchell Professor of History at the University of Michigan, adjunct professor at the Gulf Studies Center at Qatar University, and the author of a number of books. His latest is called Muhammad, Prophet of Peace Amid the Clash of Empires. Juan Cole, I've enjoyed our conversation very much, and I thank you.
Thank you, Mitch. It's always a good stop for me.
And that does it for Letters and Politics. The show is produced by Deanna Martinez. Kirsten Thomas is our engineer. You can find archives of our previous shows online at kpfa.org. I'm Mitch Jeserich, and I thank you for listening.
did not just change my life, it saved my life. So David Talbot begins his memoir, Between Heaven and Hell, the story of my stroke. Annie Lamott says the book is touching, informative, sometimes funny, sometimes harrowing. I could not put it down. I felt the same. David Talbot will appear in Berkeley on Wednesday, January 27th at the Hillside Club, 2286 Cedar Street. It's a KPFA benefit, wheelchair accessible. Quincy McCoy, KPFA's terrific manager, will be in conversation with Talbot. Conversation that promises to be tender, powerful, humorous, intimate, uncensored, pals talking. Tickets available online at brownpapertickets.com or at supportive indie bookstores. David Talbot, January 27th.
You're listening to 94.1 KPFA, 89.3 KPFB in Berkeley, 88.1 KFCF in Fresno, 97.5 K248BR in Santa Cruz, and online worldwide at kpfa.org.